We're ready? Okay. All right. Well, I apologize. We may be having some glitches with our internet today. If we do, please forgive us. There's nothing really that we can do. We we got to notice that they're having some kind of a problem, and so we're just going to continue to push on and believe that the ones who need to hear that will be presented to you. So we're in the Kybalion, and we're talking about the principle of polarity. It's really pretty mind-boggling, simple stuff if you want to look at it like that. So here's the principle: everything is dual. Everything has poles. We can see that in the earth. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but they're different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half truths, and all paradoxes may be reconciled. And so, what does all that mean? Let's find out. This principle embodies the truth that everything is dual. Everything has two poles. Everything has its pair of opposites, all of which were old Hermetic axioms. It explains the old paradoxes that have perplexed so many, which have been stated as follows. Thesis and antithesis are identical in nature, but different in degree. Opposites are the same, they're differing only in degree. The pairs of opposites may be reconciled. Extremes meet, and everything is and isn't at the same time. That's a pretty deep concept, but as you go here, you will begin. There's some questions that get asked that are really. It'll probably help you maybe to see and understand, about ourselves, because inevitably, I think that we must, in the journey to love ourselves, and as we learn to love ourselves, we actually can only then begin to learn to love other people. I think there's a level of truth that we have been brainwashed away from, that in Christianity, and probably in all organized religion. I haven't ever been in all the other religions, so I can only speak from the perspective, the testimony of where I came from. But I never saw too much of people trying to help people be better. I saw mostly being told that I wasn't better. And maybe some of you have also experienced that. So, in this whole concept, what if the reality of it is that we are both good and bad? How can we reconcile that in our lives? And I think it's one of the most valid questions we really could be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves about. How do you change and yet not change? So, everything is and yet it isn't. At the same time, all truths are but half-truths. Every truth is also half false. And you'll see the picture as the timeline gets drawn out a little bit. There are two sides to everything. We've been told that our whole lives, right? There's two sides to every story. It explains that in everything there are two poles or opposite aspects, and that opposites are really the only two extremes of the same thing. So a bad person is really just the extreme of a good person. And a good person is actually just the extreme of a bad person. Which is, I think, really the modality in which we end up using this tool of polarity, because if you'll pay attention and study, you'll find that this is functioning and going on many levels, and it will change your perspective about people. So, opposite aspects, and that opposites are really only the two extremes of the same thing, with many varying degrees between them. To illustrate, heat and cold, although opposites, are really the same thing. You could term that, if you chose to, you could term hot and cold as being temperature. They're both temperature, but they're simply the two extremes of temperature. So hot and cold, although they're opposite, they really are the same thing. The differences consisting merely of degrees of the same thing. Look at your thermometer and see if you can discover where heat terminates and cold begins. And so we've tried to do that with what freezing is, but 1 degree either way, you're still in that perspective. And so you can just and see if you can discover where heat terminates and cold begins. There is no such thing as absolute heat. There's always some level of cold in hot, no matter how hot it gets. Because it's really, in many cases with this, what you're going to actually find is that a lot of this has to do with perspective. So if we look at, let's say we look at 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? That's warmer probably than what Nebuchadnezzar could get the oven out in the middle of the plain of Dura that he threw Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael in. And yet, if you viewed 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, you would view it as cold if you pitted that against 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? By virtue, it's minuscule compared to 10,000 degrees. So once again, perspective then begins to play, and you're going to find out if you'll continue, and as we continue on this journey, you're going to find out that most things in our life can be resolved based on perspective. That could be defined and looked at as the perspective that you have now versus maybe the perspective that you need to have. If you've lived in a negative life form and you were brought up listening to negativity your whole life, that really doesn't mean that everything's negative. It simply means that your perspective of things are negative. And because it is so prominent in our lives, we've said it several times around here, and maybe some of you have also experienced this, that while not one thing has changed with the change that's going on with me, not one thing in my life has changed on the external, but nothing's the same. So perspective then becomes a very big part of whether positivity or negativity, two poles. So if you can discover where heat terminates and cold begins, there is no such thing as absolute heat or absolute cold. The two terms heat and cold simply indicate varying degrees of the same thing. We can relate to that. And that same thing which manifests as heat and cold is merely a form, variety, and rate of vibration. I'll share a thing with you. You know, Nikola Tesla taught this over 100 years ago, and the knowledge that he had was absolutely right on the money. It was not mainstream. Most people probably didn't listen to him, and yet what he spoke was as ancient of knowledge as exists on the face of the earth. So hot and cold are simply the two poles of that which we call heat, and the phenomena attendant thereupon are manifestations of the principle of polarity. The same principle manifests in the case of light and darkness, which are the same thing, the difference consisting of varying degrees between the two poles of the phenomena. Where does darkness leave off and light begin? We can have perspectives about what that means. But even in light form, we have varying degrees of light, from extremely bright to very dim. But would you say that dim light is darkness? It would be very difficult to say that. You could say dim light is darker than extremely bright light. But that's also simply a perspective. That's a picture that your mind uses to see. And so the same principles manifest in the case of light and darkness, which are the same thing, the difference consisting of varying degrees between the two poles of the phenomena. Where does darkness leave off and light begin? What is the difference between large and small? It's all perspective. Hard and soft, between black and white, between sharp and dull, between noise and quiet, between high and low, between positive and negative. The principle of polarity explains these paradoxes, and no other principle. Again? Okay. Well, as I said, Mama, once you said that, then it makes sense. I mean, it's what I'd already encountered. So, that's what I intend to do.